Call of Cthulhu 7th Edition is a Lovecraft-inspired tabletop role-playing game published by Chaosium in 2014 following a successful Kickstarter. It is based on the original Call of Cthulhu RPG written by Sandy Peterson in 1981. Peterson is credited with pioneering the concept of the unraveling mystery RPG, and this 7th edition comfortably carries that tradition. The core game comes in 2 books, the Keeper Rulebook or GM's Guide, and the Investigator's Handbook or Player's Guide. It's worth noting that running the game really only requires the Keeper's Guide. The Investigator's Handbook merely expands on some concepts like occupations, organizations, or societies, and some background info on the 1920s in the US, which is the default era of this game. The thematic engine of the game is the slow boil reveal of cosmic horror to so-called investigators, or basically anyone looking into the matter. It is inspired almost entirely on the short stories of one author. Even if you've gone down the rabbit hole of reading Lovecraft's works and a biography or two that details his tragic life, the 4 pages in the book that summarize his life and legacy are worth the read. The authors do a great job of giving you the long and short of the man's life and work, and how other authors contributed to his work during his life and after his death. Their collective creation is what ultimately formed the basis of Sandy Peterson's original Call of Cthulhu RPG, and that DNA remains even in the 7th edition. This foundation is referred to as the Cthulhu mythos. The term Cthulhu mythos does get thrown around a lot these days, but this book does a good job of describing how it's somewhat hard to pin down. The book goes on to acknowledge that the very nature of the mythos is unknowable to humans, and if it appears to be self-contradictory, it is by design. The core stats for your player, or investigator, are strength, constitution, size, dexterity, appearance, intelligence, power, and education. You are rolling up each stat with either one formula or another. From these 8 numbers and an investigator's chosen age, you derive your secondary stats like luck, move rate, starting sanity, damage bonus, and build. Occupation is an important starting feature that will inform how a character is played at the table because it will kickstart certain skills. The game is primarily set in the 1920s, thus 26 out of the 27 suggested occupations in the book fit right into that world. Each occupation offers a certain large number of skill points to distribute across your occupational starting skills. Much of the second page of the character sheet consists of backstory statements for the investigator. The game offers D10 tables for these, and these have a quasi-mechanical bearing on gameplay. One peculiar aspect of this game is the emphasis it puts on money. Your investigators not only have cash, but they also start with a credit rating, as well as a per diem that counts against a total account balance if exceeded on any given day. It's interesting to have players worry about per diems and bank account balances on one hand, while facing down cosmic forces of darkness and keeping insanity at bay on the other. I can see it working for a game master or keeper in this game by luring new players into thinking that petty cash is the most they need to be worried about, and then springing some horrible monster on them. But for veteran players, the petty cash game might be a little tiresome. Anyway, at the end of the character creation, you give your investigator gear and weapons. These should line up with their strongest skills, but of course you should keep an eye on that bank balance. Skill checks are at the heart of this game. Your investigator starts with about 8 bumped up occupational skills, and you level them up by using them. There are 31 named skills on the character sheet, but several of these are specialized, like foreign language and science, and there are spots for completely different skills that you can add yourself. One of the difficulties of this game for beginners, on both the keeper's and the investigator's side, is taking in all of these skills and knowing which one to apply or emphasize in each situation. This might make for some halting gameplay amongst neophytes, but a well-read and seasoned keeper could no doubt be able to run a smooth game. When a skill is successfully used, the checkbox for that skill is checked on the character sheet. Then at the end of the session or at some logical stopping point, the player will roll a D100 and try to get above their current skill level in order to improve it. 95 to 100 is an automatic success here. If the improvement roll is successful, then they roll a D10 and add that to their skill level. A skill is checked when an investigator encounters an obstacle or problem in the game that is not automatically overcome. If your lawyer investigator is trying to use her skill in language other French to make polite conversation, and she has a 27 in that skill, she must roll a 27 or lower on a D100 to succeed. If the situation is deemed hard by the keeper, she has to roll a 13 or lower to succeed. If the situation is extreme, then it's a 5 or lower on a French scale of 27. Failure on a roll results in anything that the keeper wants it to be. Players can ask to push the roll or re-roll by describing the investigator's concerted effort. A failed push roll should result in the loss of sanity, equipment, hit points, or a dire downward change in the overall situation for the investigator or group. You can't push, combat, or chase rolls. The game brings a few other notable mechanics to the table. Roll a 1 on a check and it's a critical success, which is up to the keeper to describe. Roll a 96 through 100 and it's a fumble, also up to the keeper. Luck rolls are made with a D100 to determine a situation that can't be made with a skill or attribute. Rather than solving actual puzzles at the table, players just roll a D100 against their intelligence stat. Penalized rolls have players rolling 2 or more different 10 dice, keeping the worst one. Penalty dice are foisted on players in a number of situations. Likewise, bonus dice can be granted on a roll, where the player rolls 2 or more dice for the 10 spot and keeps the best of them. Combat is done in order, sorted by highest dex to lowest. As an example, a fight between 2 unarmed opponents is resolved by rolling the fighting skill of the opponents against a D100. The opponent with the higher level of success wins. If neither beats their own fighting skill, then there is no damage. Ties go to the attacker if the defender tries to fight back. If the defender tries to dodge an attack, they would roll against their dodge skill instead of fighting. Ties go to the defender if they are trying to dodge. But even with a successful dodge roll, the opponent rolling fighting will land a hit if they achieve a superior level of success. Damage on a landed hit for unarmed humans is D3. For weapons, the damage rating is listed by weapon. Unspecialized weapons like a chair or knife would use the fighting brawl subskill, while something like a sword would require a fighting sword skill. Doing things like tackling or shoving an opponent involves the build rating of the attacker and defender. The smaller of the two opponents will take up to 2 penalty dice on the opposed roll if they have a smaller build. 3 or more points difference in the build rating means the smaller of the two can't do anything physical with bare hands. There are additional notes for being outnumbered, reducing damage with armor, penalties for attacking an opponent behind cover, bonuses for aiming, etc. Where it starts to get hairy is the rules for automatic and burst fire weapons, in which multiple attack rolls have to be made with different numbers of penalty dice, etc. Damage will inflict either normal loss of hit points, or if a single attack equals half or more of one's max HP, a major wound. Your HP ticks away to 0 like most any other RPG, but when you catch a major wound, you fall prone and roll a con check to stay conscious. When dropping to 0 HP, the investigator is unconscious. They will naturally recover 1 hit point per day, but if dropped by a major wound, the investigator is dying. They must make a con roll every round until someone with a successful first aid roll can stabilize them. A failed con roll at this point results in immediate death. Even after a successful first aid roll, the investigator only gets 1 temporary hit point and must continue to roll con checks every round. In order to stop this, a successful medicine check is required. Long-term recovery from a major wound is slow and arduous, measured in weeks of game time. It is only at this point, a third of the way through the Keeper's Rulebook, that it becomes clear that combat in this game is extremely perilous, and taking on damage is a dicey prospect for players. Call of Cthulhu imposes a sort of mini-game anytime a chase occurs during a game session. In the event that one character begins to chase another, everyone at the table needs to follow these steps. First, figure out everyone's adjusted move rating for the chase. If on foot, everyone makes a con roll. If in a car, make a drive auto skill roll. For example, a deep one is chasing a single investigator. Both roll a D100 against their con. On a success, they keep their current move rating. On an extreme success, they get a +1 to their move for the chase. On a failure, a -1. If the investigator ends up with a higher move than the deep one, there is no chase. He gets away. But if the deep one has a move equal to or higher, then the chase is on. Then plot out a linear series of locations. These are not spaced out equally, geographically speaking. They are narrative pinpoints which the characters will run or drive through. Then plot out the hazards and barriers between each location. These will require rolls for all characters before getting to the next location. The Keeper chooses starting locations for everyone, typically the pursuer, 2 behind the fleer. Everyone is given 1 or more movement actions. Turn order is determined by the highest dex to lowest, and every character spends their 1 or more movement actions to either move forward to the next location, initiate an attack or spell, or spin towards overcoming a barrier. Hazards on foot can come in many forms, and usually will require a dex roll by the player. Failing to overcome a hazard will cost precious movement actions, possibly eating into the next round's supply of movement actions. Attacks can be made from different locations during a chase if a projectile weapon is used, but for close quarter attacks, characters have to be at the same location. There are some additional rules regarding crashing vehicles into each other, taking into account the sizes of the different vehicles. There are also optional rules for choosing different routes during a chase and other stuff. I'd say that a table should be comfortable with the linear chase rules before taking on the optional extra rules, but the mechanics explained in this book have clearly been playtested extensively, given how many contingency cases have been explained. On the whole, the chase rules are as elaborate as the sanity rules in this game, but they don't form the heart and soul of the game. The sanity rules do. Characters will start with a cap of 99 sanity points. Learning the skill of Cthulhu Mythos will point for point reduce that cap down from 99. They lose sanity points over the course of a game, typically by encountering monsters or the unnatural, or by being in an extremely stressful situation. When facing an encounter, investigators roll a d100 against their current sanity score. Some situations will result in a loss of sanity even with a successful roll. A fumbled roll will result in max sanity lost for that situation. Losing 5 or more sanity in a single roll could lead to temporary insanity, and losing 20% or more total current sanity in a single day of game time results in indefinite insanity. When sanity reaches 0, the investigator reaches permanent insanity. This usually means the player has lost control of the investigator completely. The book lays out several phases of madness within the temporary and indefinite insanity varieties. When reaching either of these conditions, an investigator experiences a quote-unquote bout of madness that lasts for a short period of time that is up to the keeper, lasting up to 10 rounds, and involves amending their backstory with corruption, as well as a fun involuntary action table to roll on. The second phase to picking up temporary or indefinite insanity is called underlying insanity, which is up to the player to roleplay out. If an investigator has a phobia or mania, of which the book contains a D100 table for each, then exposure to the trigger should lead to an obsessive, overwhelming response. I think the game is rather devious in that it asks the player to impose these terrible things on their investigators themselves, rather than having the keeper impose the details. But the keeper can heap on even more pain by imposing reality check rolls, which can result in even more sanity loss, or Cthulhu Mythos points that reduce max sanity. Recovery from insanity is tough, involving either private care or institutionalization. These come down to a D100 roll that can offer up to 3 points of sanity recovery at a stretch. Other ways to scoop up sanity is by the keeper rewarding them at the end of the session, reaching 90% on any given skill, a successful psychoanalysis skill check by another character, or any form of self-help that a player can adequately describe. An investigator starts with the number of magic points equal to a fifth of their power. Magic points are spent on spells, as well as activating artifacts, powering gates and portals, and things like that. Once MP is exhausted, an investigator can dip into their hit points instead, but the keeper will then assign some gross or disturbing physical manifestation of this deeper sacrifice. 1 to 3 MP is regained per in-game hour, but HP is still only recovered the hard way. The most fun aspect of learning spells is that the keeper is expected to present the spell to players with esoteric terms, not by the actual name of the spell. Every spell has alternate names, which keeps things nice and mysterious, especially for the uninitiated. The book notes 3 ways to learn a spell. 1, through books. This process should take long weeks of study by the investigator, but can be sped up if needed. 2, spells can be learned from another person as well. This method should take much less time than book learning. And 3, There is learning through a mythos entity that imparts a dream or vision on the investigator. This method of spell delivery can be instantaneous. Spells are hard to cast the first time, but become easier after the first time. Pushing on a failed casting roll or asking to reroll is extremely dangerous, since a failed pushed cast will result in one ugly thing or another, not to mention that magic points, sanity, and/or power point costs are increased by up to 600%. Merely pushing the casting roll could exhaust all magic points and cut so far into hit points that it causes a major wound. The Keeper's Guide lists over 50 spells, divided into 3 main categories: Call and Dismiss, Contact, and Enchantment. Many of the spells are relatively straightforward, describing a cost, casting time, and discrete effect, but a fair number of spells are unpacked across multiple pages. Call Deity, for example, lists distinct details on calling 7 different deities. Likewise, the Contact spell lists 15 creatures, each with different spell behavior. The Gate spell is detailed with remarkable granularity as well. For the most part, the spells are dark and dripping with horror. One thing to note is that due to the incredible cost of casting, it is not likely that players will get to acquire and cast many of these spells through a single investigator. Rather, they would need to spend quite a lot of time with the game, maybe years of play, to explore each of these spells. There is an incredible amount of detail put into what are called the Mythos books, and the process of how an investigator absorbs the knowledge from one of them. This stems from the many instances in Lovecraft stories where characters or narrators mention one kind of forbidden text or another, and the rules in this book rightfully treat a Mythos book as a dangerous thing. In a nutshell, an investigator can choose to engage with a Mythos tome or not. To do so requires the loss of sanity and max sanity in exchange for those Cthulhu Mythos skill points and/or specific spells. Upon deeper study, investigators can extract specific knowledge pertaining to the mystery at hand at the Keeper's discretion. Perhaps more approachable and comprehensible are the 20 artifacts and relics listed in the book. Each of these is derived in one way or another from the pantheon of Cthulhu Mythos short stories written by Lovecraft and others. Unlike some of the spells, these objects are all described very tightly, and they are all begging to be inserted into a game session. Many of them can act as the crux of a mystery, or a tantalizing hook to draw investigators in, and they are all pretty odd. The Keeper's Guide presents over 75 monsters and beasts, each with 6 core stats, and most importantly a build rating or size. Differences in build between attacker and defender can preclude maneuvers such as throwing, shoving, grasping, or tackling, something that comes up enough in this game that the authors thought it was worth unpacking quite a bit. If the power and intelligence of a monster is high enough, they gain access to spells that can be cast with relative ease. There are several categories of monsters, most of them intelligent and deadly. The first is Mythos monsters, of which there are 34. Every single one of these is lovingly detailed, and like the artifacts in the book, could singularly serve as the center point of an entire mystery. Most of these take up a page apiece and offer enough backstory for a multi-session mystery. Given the deadliness of most of these, investigators can't meet too many of them in a single game session before dying or going insane. They each serve more as a single horrifying finale of a mystery rather than hordes of something that a player can churn through. Then there are the 28 deities of the mythos, which include true gods as well as godlike beings and their avatars. If the mythos monsters were tough, these are at a level that must be handled with the highest level of care by the Keeper. The mere cultists or remote manifestations of these deities are enough to give investigators a run for their money. Between the mythos monsters and deities, the Keeper's Guide offers far more details about Lovecraftian beasts than Lovecraft himself or any of his contemporaries ever did in their short stories. Which is to say, if you're a fan of the monsters of Lovecraft and his ilk, the Keeper's Guide is worth it just for the monsters section. I really appreciated that they managed to include one sketch for every monster listed. Some of the imaginings here are the best I've ever seen, considering a lot of them lack much description in the short stories from which they originated. As I mentioned earlier, Call of Cthulhu 7th edition comes in 2 books, but the Keeper's Guide contains everything needed to run the game. Everything in this video came from the Keeper's Guide, and I still didn't include the 2 sample scenarios, section on how to run the game, and 1920s equipment and weapons section. This book runs about 450 pages. The Investigator's Handbook, which runs another 290 pages, brings a lot more detail into investigator backgrounds in the 1920s, and is a sure bet for players who want all in on this setting and system. That's a total of 740 pages of core material, but Chaosium has also published a starter's guide with a much more concise presentation in the form of a 24-page rules primer and a one-player adventure that unpacks the rules, as well as 3 adventures handpicked from hundreds of different modules over the decades. The starter's guide is where you want to go if you're not sure about this game yet. Then if you are, you pick up the Keeper's Guide. Then if you're in love, the Investigator's Handbook. Chaosium treats the H.P. Lovecraft Sandy Peterson legacy with the best possible care. The basic mechanics of the game are simple, and some of the more complex rules can be surgically removed without affecting the soul of this game, which is to pit investigators against the cold, unknowable cosmic truth that lies just beyond our understanding. Just don't forget to track those per diem expenses. Links for everything are below. Thanks for watching. This is Dave signing off. See ya.